A 7-ship British fleet cuts into the pirate bay of Nassau with imperial pomp and fixes its anchors into the seabed for the night. Captain Woodes Rogers has triumphantly arrived to impose the will of His Royal Majesty, King George of Great Britain and Ireland. In the morning he will tame this wretched pirate haven and finally cleanse it from scum and villainy. Night falls, and the crescent moon lights up the deep ocean. There is the gentle crack of bending wood as the ships push off from the island. The nearest ship sails directly towards Rogers. It heaves forward and bursts into flames. The crew escapes on cue as shrapnel blisters and spits in orange streaks over black waters. Crackling inferno spreads to one British ship, and the others scatter in the frenzy. The fireship's crew rowed to the second vessel and joined their tenacious leader, the ruthless pirate who dens to defy the king, Charles Vane. Woodes Rogers watches him escape into the smoldering, tropical night. Vane understood perfectly well why Rogers and the civilized world wanted to see him hang. Theft, torture, and murder were sins to which he shamelessly admitted. He reserved less sympathy for the schools of pirates, who had betrayed him indeed. Many men he knew had stayed behind to welcome Woodes Rogers into Nassau. They had elected to accept this so-called king's pardon. But Vane had taken his chances. He was no coward and wouldn't give up his paradise that easily. Nassau, which constituted the island of New Providence in the Caribbean, had fallen out of British hands some years ago. Its winding farmlands and cobwebbed cannons duly became the property of Charles Vane Blackbeard, Benjamin Hornigold, and thousands of other pirates. Together they had fashioned the island into a republic of pirates from which to plunder. This corner of the Atlantic, a liminal anarchy between English, Spanish, and French dominions. But so great were those spoils that those royal dynasties of Europe fretted upon their thrones and decried the unkempt outlaws who so wantonly emptied their treasures. And so, Woodes Rogers had been tasked with their extermination. Despite Charles Vane's fiery attack, Rogers successfully made landfall. The next morning, he pardoned every pacified pirate ashore and raised the Union Jack atop the dusty fort. The hunt for the others who roamed the seas was already underway. Those who persisted in their thievery were brought back to Nassau and walked to the gallows in front of their former shipmates who had accepted the pardon. Woodes Rogers sat as governor of Nassau. An age of order was upon them. This seemed a momentous occasion. If Charles Vane, Blackbeard, and the other stragglers dared to resist, they would have a front row seat to the end of their way of life. And indeed, this appeared to be the death of a people who had long thrived like mold on the dark underbellies of celebrated empires, a people whose blood-stained legacy of freedom, butchery, and rebellion had begun eons before. A proud history of piracy. Millennia long preceded these men. From empire-toppling flotillas to singular scoundrels. And back again, this is their story. This is the story of the pirates of the West. Pirates didn't really have schools. Their training was mainly from their previous lives as legitimate seafolk, taking their previous sailing skills and using them to their advantage. These days, it's harder to do this so directly. So services like Skillshare are hugely helpful to train up for a new career or progress in your current one. And it's not just great for advancing your career. Skillshare is an online learning community. Thousands of inventive and creative classes to choose from. One great class one always come back to on Skillshare is creative video, storytelling and editing, making the most of stock footage. We use stock footage mixed in with images here at Voices of the Past, and this class has been great for exploring new ways to create videos and tell stories. It's just one of the many fantastic classes they have on documentaries and filmmaking. And it's just as useful as my previous recommendation, creating a modern cinematic documentary film with soul. A staff pick and a gem on the platform. So Skillshare are the perfect option to make the rest of 2022 a productive and creative journey. The first 1,000 people to use the link in my description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so you can start exploring your creativity today. Thanks to Skillshare for supporting history content on YouTube. All at once, the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. They were coming forward towards Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. Life proceeded in Egypt, as it had for thousands of years. High priests venerated monuments to the pharaohs of old, while preaching cryptic wisdom of the gods. Camels carried travelers across searing dunes, and crocodiles cooled their scales in the flowing Nile. Along its banks, common folk tended to the fertile earth by day, and spent cold nights cloistered in their mud-brick dwellings. And above it all, on an ornate throne amidst monuments to his own glory, sat a king beset by tortured thoughts. The 42-year-old Pharaoh Ramses III was the living incarnation of the avian god Horus, said to rule the very movement of the sun and moon. But Ramses had been fated to rule over a bloody age. For it was 1175 BC, and the very idea of civilization itself was in danger. An existential threat stalked the Mediterranean. Powerful confederations of seafaring tribes, whose ranks were filled with masterful sailors, savvy traders, and tenacious pirates. Coastal cities were engulfed in flames. They desolated its people, and its land was like that, which has never come into being. Ramses watched as the pirates ushered in the Bronze Age, collapsed seeing his rivals fall to ruin. Syria, the Levant, Cyprus, and Greece would crumble. The final hour of Egypt must have been close. As these proto-pirates charted course to the Nile, the pharaoh called forth men from all corners of the kingdom and furnished them with shining lances, bows, and chariots. The enemy flooded into the delta. Their light vessels carried raiders, clad in all manner of armor, but undivided in their determination to topple the old world. A hail of arrows rained down. The Egyptians charged with lances, squeezed their opponents at a choke point, and ran their ships aground. Then they ripped the pirates onto the sand and hacked them to death. They were dragged in, enclosed and prostrated on the beach, killed and made into heaps from tail to head. Finally, a grisly, red tide beat against the sides of overturned ships. Ramses had prevailed, and the onslaught of the piratical sea peoples was halted. And so it was this apocalyptic battle of the Delta that was memorialized on the outer walls of Medinet, Habu. It may be the earliest depiction of a pirate attack in existence. It is likely that for as long as people have elected to transport things of value over the ocean, there have existed people who endeavored to steal those things. But if piracy comprises robbery and violence on the high seas and coastal areas, the sea peoples show that its practitioners need not be mere ship-borne bandits. On the contrary, the sea peoples traded, migrated, and prudently navigated political allegiances. Indeed, the pre-classical ancient Greeks understood that piracy had once been considered an entirely legitimate source of financial sustenance. The jagged edges of the Mediterranean were unsuitable for large-scale agriculture, but passing trade ships hugged the coastlines. Like tempting sirens, they beckoned sailors and fishermen towards a treacherous life of piracy. Barbarians were tempted to turn pirates under the conduct of their most powerful men, the motives being to serve their own greed and to support the needy. They would fall upon a town unprotected by walls and consisting of a mere collection of villages, and would plunder it. Indeed, this came to be the main source of their livelihood, no disgrace being yet attached to such an achievement, but even some glory. While small bands of piratical opportunists proved an inevitable reality to the ancient world, many of the most fervent practitioners of piracy were more legitimate states or confederacies. Entire people like the aliens and Phoenicians participated in large-scale trading and cultural exchange, in addition to fairly indiscriminate piracy. But pirates nevertheless thrived on instability, in a pattern that would characterize piracy for millennia to come. Places that had fallen into ruin due to war or neglect became the most attractive pirate dens. The cracked vestiges of the Minoan civilization on Crete and islands scarred by Peloponnesian conflict became bases for pirates to organize raids on ships and coasts. Ancient pirates conquered ill-guarded land, pillaged ships and coastlines, and conducted slave raids in a manner not dissimilar from contemporary empires. Defining which kinds of ship-borne robbery fell outside the law would continue to be a matter of perspective and convenience. But the winds of empire threatened piracy. As Alexander toppled cities and the star of Rome enveloped Greece, pirate hegemony waned. The Northern Greek Aetolian League, which had practiced large-scale piracy against its enemies, was defeated by the Roman Republic in 192 BC. But the Romans had simply pushed the issue beyond their gaze. The Aetolian pirates fled and set up operations in the nook of Asia Minor, based in the dilapidated towns of Cilicia. The most fearsome pirate community the ancient world had ever seen now swarmed the Mediterranean. In their voracious slave raiding, these Cilician pirates made friends in powerful places. The hostage refused to stay quiet. In truth, his captors found him amusing. Drunken cackling of sunburnt pirates echoed along the coast as they watched him perform poems and speeches. With boyish pluck, the warm turquoise borders of the eastern Mediterranean, his tranquil prison, the confused Syrians listened intently to the brash young Roman their hostage had suggested. They raised the ransom for his freedom to more accurately reflect his status, and the Cilicians had complied. His countrymen may have controlled the western Mediterranean, but the eastern half remained pirate territory. The Cilicians attacked with little regard for the allegiances of their victims. The powerful landowners and senators of Rome nevertheless tolerated them, as the profitability of their sweeping plantations depended on a stable relationship with the pirates. For peacetime in the Republic made for bad business. Without conquered peoples to be sold in Roman markets, Roman landowners turned to the Cilician pirates, who eagerly sold them people they had captured in slave raids. If pirates were to roam the seas, empires would continue to find ways to use their presence to their advantage. But Cilician looting of Roman shipping also created fervent enemies in Rome. And so Rome began to enact anti-piracy laws. The derision with which the Roman hostage treated his captors may have reflected this change in attitudes. When he wished to sleep, the Roman would interrupt the late-night revelry of the pirates and tell them to stop talking. In passing, he muttered, teasing threats to have his captors executed. After a month, the ransom came, and the young captive, named Julius Caesar, sailed off. The pirates decided to linger on the coast a little while longer, bobbing at anchor and basking in their earnings. But their celebrations were soon cut short. A fleet appeared on the horizon. Caesar had returned. He had the pirates thrown in prison and reclaimed the ransom money. He went to Pergamon, took the pirates out of prison, and crucified the lot of them, just as he had often told them he would do when he was on the island, and they imagined that he was joking. But Cilician pirates continued to undermine the stability of the Roman Republic. Indeed, when Spartacus launched a slave revolt 2 years later, in 73 BC, the Sicilians supported his efforts, though when Spartacus met with the pirates and paid them to transport 2,000 of his rebels to Sicily, the Sicilians took the gifts and sailed off without them. They then burnt the Roman port of Ostia and kidnapped 2 Roman senators. Now common Romans felt the material shock on grain supplies in the economy. They looked to the rising general Pompey to confront the issue, and he in turn gathered support for a costly mission: the complete annihilation of the Cilician pirates. The Senate passed the Gabinian Law. The law gave him dominion over the sea, this side of the Pillars of Hercules, over all the mainland, to the distance of 400 furlongs from the sea. These limits included almost all places in the Roman world, and the greatest nations and most powerful kings were comprised within them. With over 100,000 troops at his disposal, Pompey sent forth his army to hound the pirates. At every corner, they blockaded and demolished pirate lairs and drove many of the stragglers back to Cilicia. Roman ships followed them and formed impenetrable rows of blockades, forcing the pirates onto land. From there, the Roman troops slaughtered the pirates with mechanical efficiency. Upon their surrender, Pompey had Cilician leaders. Killed the others, he showed mercy. Reflecting, therefore, that by nature man neither is, nor becomes a wild or an unsocial creature, but is transformed by the unnatural practice of vice, he determined to transfer the men from the sea to the land. and let them have a taste of gentle life by being accustomed to dwell in cities and to till the ground. Pompey had tamed the seas. In all, he had razed 120 pirate bases, destroyed 500 ships, and killed 10,000 pirates. A Pax Romana washed over the Mediterranean, and in the coming centuries, friends of Rome were free to sail, without serious danger piracy. It seemed had been defeated once and for all, so long as the eternal city of Rome stood. The Western pirate would remain extinct. A shout echoed through the cold corridors of a castle. Pirate brethren scrambled to their posts and peered beyond the walls. Cutting across soft mounds of snow was a line of clattering iron and black crosses. The pirates readied their feeble defenses as the Teutonic knights marched, with gleaming swords and crossbows. The soldiers of Christ had come to carry out a royal bounty, a quest to slaughter the doomed pirates in their fortress and finally end medieval piracy. A bloody era of seaborne banditry, inaugurated centuries earlier by heathens. The pagans from the northern regions came with a naval force to Britain, like stinging hornets, and spread on all sides like fearful wolves robbed. Taurens slaughtered not only beasts of burden, sheep and oxen, but even priests and deacons, and companies of monks and nuns. And they came to the church of Lindisfarne, laid everything waste with grievous plundering, trampled the holy places and polluted steps, dug up the altars, and seized all the treasures of the holy church. They killed some of the brothers, took some away with them in fetters. Many they drove out naked and loaded with insults. Some they drowned in the sea. Threw beards doused in frothy mead. Men of the north orchestrated the downfall of far-off kingdoms. In their mead halls they gathered, before a crackling hearth and wooden throne, in a quest for untold riches and immortal glory. In Valhalla, the fractured nations of Northern Europe had left shining treasures and exotic goods on their shores, exposed and ready to be plundered. Viking piracy did not constitute robbery on the high seas, but instead took the form of lightning coastal raids, shipborne attacks on wherever they saw. Wealth earned them precious artifacts and innumerable slaves. Over the centuries, disjointed raids on small villages and monasteries had grown to fully fledged excursions upon cities and vast territories. These Vikings or raiders terrorized the distant corners of Europe. The audacious Hastings and Byron Ironside ventured as far as Islamic Spain, sowing chaos on the sun-kissed Guadalquivir River. In Seville, for the stability of the Western Roman Empire had long since collapsed. Though the Eastern Empire had clung on, they held no real sway in Rome's heartland. And soon, Muslim factions had gained footholds in North Africa, Iberia, and the Middle East. Then came the Crusades and the Eastern Roman Empire too, fractured into a series of rump states, ceasing to exist in the ruins of this Second Empire. Pirates returned the very sailors who had once filled the ranks of the Byzantine navy, set up hideouts at its crumbling corners, and began to ambush merchant ships. But rumblings from the east foretold a new wave of chaos. An unstoppable horde of steppe warriors, riding west under the banner of Genghis Khan. With pirates infesting the coasts and Mongols at the gates, a claimant to the defunct Byzantine throne emerged. Michael VIII retook Constantinople and resurrected an empire which had lain dormant for 6 decades. But the return of Byzantine authority did not guarantee stability. Unable to muster a true national navy, he decided to weaponize Mediterranean pirates for Byzantine ends. He called pirate leaders from their remote hideouts and turned them into his privateers. Sailors who could use their own ships to plunder under Byzantine authority. Legitimate piracy was born. This would set a precedent for the centuries to come. Pirates were above all shapeshifters, opportunists, disposed to true piracy at times, and the legal protection of privateering at others. Men who had for years ruled as pirates now justified their pillaging and violence against Italian trade under the banner of the Byzantine Empire. For a cash-strapped kingdom, seaborne mercenaries presented a viable alternative to a legitimate navy. And Northern Europe would soon realize this as well. The deposed Swedish King Albert sat in a dungeon, in desperate need of aid. Scattered beyond his city of Stockholm were forested specks of land, set in dark and briny waters. Glacial currents shimmered with herring and bent under the strain of hostile ships that infested the harbor. This was a suffocating blockade. A gift from the new Swedish monarch, Margaret of Denmark. At roughly 40 years of age, the shrewd queen, Margaret claimed rulership over all Scandinavia. The dark-haired queen, known to be beautiful and intimidating in equal measure, was hell-bent on uniting the region at all costs. Thus, as Stockholm remained loyal to King Albert, Margaret decided to starve the city. No ordinary sailor could penetrate the swarm. The allies of King Albert turned instead to professionals. Handsomely paid German mercenaries were sent to slip through the blockade and run supplies into Stockholm, wreaking havoc on the merchant vessels of Margaret and her allies. Together, they formed a guild called the Victual Brothers. Now in need of a safe base of operations, the Victual Brothers took the town of Visby, on the island of Gotland, one of Margaret's Swedish territories, and in 1394, the unabashed pirates became the de facto rulers of Gotland. The seas were in chaos. The Victual Brothers assailed so many passing ships, the trade became all but impossible. Economies floundered, the fishing industry was halted, and food supplies dwindled. In exasperated meetings, Margaret called for aid. It was an old order of knights that took up the Queen's quest. Based in Prussia, the Crusaders of the Teutonic Order came forward with troops, prepared with broadswords and exquisite shining armor. They boasted menacing, visored helmets and shields bearing black crosses. The knights desired to control Gotland. Queen Margaret promised to grant their wish if they could clear the island of the pirates. And so in the winter of 1397, the Victual brothers docked their ships. For the last time, almost all came ashore to weather the Scandinavian cold. On Gotland, the knights and their Prussian troops sailed out, in secret to meet them 80, for ships and for 1,000 men were to attack. Under the leadership of Grand Master Conrad von Jungengunn, they clambered ashore and met the pirates in the snow. As negotiations for peace took place, the pirates and their Prussian army marched to every corner of the island. They found the pirates tucked away in castles and forts. They laid siege to their defenses and hacked to death. And filled with arrows the Victual brothers, they found the knights, finally demolished the city of Visby, and conquered the island. They afforded the pirates 3 days to leave. Those who lingered were captured and killed. Leaders like Klaus Störtebeker continued pirating for years. But even he was caught, brought in and executed with his crew. If European waters had truly fallen into the hands of powerful kings and queens like Margaret, then piracy would need to move beyond their gaze. Perhaps there was money to be made further afield. And indeed, in a century's time, Europeans would begin making dangerous forays into an uncharted ocean for explorers and conquistadors, had stumbled upon a new hemisphere of jungles, tropical islands, and vast civilizations brimming with wealth. Pirates and politically useful privateers would soon take notice. Eyes of a scowling Aztec god set into priceless gold. Chests of clattering gems, lumps of silver and sacred headdresses. A live jaguar, baring its teeth with every sway of the ship. And a Spanish sailor, trying his best to not make eye contact. Stolen souvenirs from the New World, courtesy of Hernan Cortés. Cortés and his ironclad conquistadors had waded through the Mexican jungle, orchestrating a large, indigenous resistance against Aztec rule. They had then used the chaos to wrest control of the region and bleed the crumbling empire of Montezuma of its abundant wealth. Now the trio of Spanish ships creaked home, heavy with treasure. The sailors were to guard the secret cargo at all costs. Their gaze swept over the horizon as they awaited a pair of armed vessels to escort them on the last leg of their journey. But instead, one by one, strange ships rose above the curve of the Atlantic. 5 mysterious boats swarmed after the Spanish trio. The treasure-laden ships groaned and clanked as the Spaniards wheeled hard in the opposite direction. The attackers dogged them for hours, until at last they apprehended 2 of them. With sharpened blades and feathered flamboyance, Captain John Flory and his French crew demanded they surrender, lest they come aboard by force and duly butcher every Spaniard they saw. The exhausted Spaniards surrendered without fanfare, and the Frenchmen came aboard to haul away the treasure chest by chest. In the eyes of France, Jean Flory was not a criminal, but a hero, for he possessed a document called a letter of marque. These were licenses issued during war, which offered sailors the legal permission of their home country to hunt, attack, and capture non-combat vessels of rival nations. Men who might have otherwise been hunted as pirates could function as private agents of the state or privateers allowed to declare and keep most of the loot they plundered. Privateers like Fleury were the product of a changing Europe, whose fractured kingdoms had begun to crystallize into potent empires. The Kingdom of France had risen in competition with the other established monarchies of Spain, Portugal, and the Holy Roman Empire. Blocked in the east by the Muslim Ottoman Empire, these warring Western European dynasties began seeking alternative routes to the lucrative East Indies. Columbus had made landfall on American soil in 1492, and now conquistadors sailed about the Americas in search of glory, land, and treasure. But if Spain had truly landed in a new world, her burgeoning empire would become the natural target of her rivals. Even after his capture, as John Fleury swung from the gallows, the Frenchman had set something in motion. His private hearing had revealed to the world what riches the Spanish had uncovered in their grisly New World conquests, and placed a target on their treasure-laden vessels. And in 1536 the French attacked Havana and other Spanish New World ports. The following year, French privateers cut in half the Spanish income from the New World. Spain recognized its treasure. Ships were in dire need of protection, so the Crown developed the floater system. No longer would treasure ships travel exposed across the Atlantic. Well-armed convoys were rallied to escort them. Seaside forts with armed soldiers and cannons would also be raised around key ports. And in the wake of peace between Spain and France, in 1559 French letters of marque dried up, and legitimate French privateers disappeared from the Spanish Main. But that was far from the end. For across the Channel, Elizabeth I took up their mantle. The English Queen, a staunch Protestant, viewed Spain as a bitter political and religious rival. Armed with her own letters of marque, she let loose her sea dogs. Camped at the edge of a chirping jungle stood a goateed adventurer, an intrepid Englishman with vengeance in his heart. For this secret mission, Francis Drake had assembled a band of loot-hungry individuals, English privateers like himself, the French buccaneer L.A. Tetsu, and a network of savvy runaway slaves. Drake had tracked the Spanish treasure shipments all the way here to the Isthmus of Panama. In the morning, mule loads would secretly cart South American treasures to the city of Nombre de Dios before they were shipped back to Spain. The son of a farmer, Drake desired most of all riches and glory. The Spanish had thwarted his commercial endeavors. In the New World, they were a natural target. Bells rang out, the caravan approached. 200 mules labored forward, laden with 30 tons of New World treasure. Dozens of Spanish soldiers marched alongside them. Drake met them head-on. In the end, these soldiers thought it the best way to leave their mules with us and to seek for more help abroad, in which meantime we took some pain to ease some of the mules, which were heaviest load of their carriage, and because we ourselves were somewhat weary, we were contented with a few bars and coins of gold, as we could well carry burying about 15 tons of silver. Spanish reinforcements would arrive any minute. With glowing gold in their arms, Drake and his men marched for miles, under damp vines and dangling vipers. Finally, they neared the edge of the mountainous jungle. As they stumbled onto the beach, where they left their ships, they found that they had disappeared. Spanish vessels looming along the coastline. In their place, the pirates could see Their capture and death were imminent. Drake acted quickly. He ordered his men to bury their gold and make a raft. From the trees they drifted 10 miles down the coast until they reached his flagship and safety. Drake later returned to recover the gold, took a captain's portion for himself, and divided the rest amongst the French and English. This first foray into the world of privateering would enable an illustrious career. Drake returned to England a celebrity of sorts and forged a close relationship with the Queen, who affectionately referred to him as my pirate, sending him on various unofficial missions to plunder the ships of her Spanish rivals in his elegant vessel, the Golden Hind. Drake circumnavigated the planet, harassing and plundering Spanish ports and ships. Along the way, driven more by opportunity than any lofty ideals, Drake could just as easily plunder the Spanish Main, shoulder to shoulder with runaway slaves, as he could sell captured Africans into slavery. And after warding off the Spanish Armada's attack on England, Drake became something of a national hero. Of course, self-interest could underlie his actions at any time. In 1588, when tasked with shadowing the invading Spanish Armada, he defied orders and instead hunted after a treasure-filled ship. Since the crown took its cut of all privateer plunder, Drake hid half of this stolen gold before returning to London and bought himself a mansion. This was the unique duality of privateering, where greed and self-interest could shakily coexist. With national service French, English, and Dutch privateers readily hoisted their sails for the promise of untold wealth and were hailed as rugged heroes in their home countries. An account of Drake's exploits, co-signed by the man himself, was titled Sir Francis Drake Revived, calling upon this dull or effeminate age to follow his noble steps for gold and silver. Though peace between Spain and England would come, and the era of unchecked privateering would pass, that same century saw the terrifying rise of a pirate power. Further east, perched on the northern edge of Africa, Muslim pirates attacked the very heart of the Christian empires that laid claim to the Americas. Conquistadors left American soil and returned to the Mediterranean in anxious haste. A storm was brewing. It was said that until the late 19th century, a mountain of skulls stood on the Tunisian island of Djerba. Passers-by would gaze upon a yellowed tower of human bone, sunken faces with mouths agape. The heads had been harvested from Spanish sailors 3 centuries prior. They were the victims of a man called Dragut. The newest slave brought with him notoriety. Rumors about him had spread throughout the stinking Italian ship tales of his escapades. When black stacks of smoke had bloomed along the Italian coast, and his pointed ships carried away goods and people, they said he was a great Barbary pirate by the name of Dragut. Whispers spread that he had even trained under the famed corsair Hayred and Barbarossa together, felling Italian fortresses and capturing precious merchant ships from distant infidels. These rumors were true, like all Barbary corsairs. Dragut had acted as a pirate or privateer, ravaging Christian coastlines and exchanging a cut of the loot for safety and status in the Islamic coastal polities of North Africa, or the so-called Barbary states. The region offered little in the way of natural resources, so rulers had developed states reliant on mass piracy. Though functionally quite independent, the Barbary states fell under the nominal control of the mighty Ottoman Empire, which spanned from Greece to Africa. Barbary privateers could be called upon by the Ottomans in times of war, and Dragut's privateering had earned him prestige among the Ottoman leadership. Most Barbary rulers were in fact corsairs themselves. But today Dragut possessed neither power nor pride. He had been captured by Italians after a bloody raid and condemned to the oar, a back-breaking life aboard an Italian vessel. In the sweltering belly of the ship, Dragut heaved and pushed and pulled the oars. Day after day, his weary muscles ached and his throat grew parched. And so the once notorious pirate festered in obscurity. The man who had stolen and kidnapped countless goods and people now appeared destined to die a slave. Stripped of Dragut's prowess, the Barbary pirates looked vulnerable. At this time, Charles V reigned over much of Europe, and with the blessing of the Pope, he called upon the nations of Christendom to sail out against the Ottoman-backed Barbary pirates. To challenge the Ottomans was a dangerous proposition. It was, after all, Ottoman overland hegemony that had initially compelled Europeans, like Columbus and Vasco da Gama, to seek alternative trade routes to Asia. Nobody appreciated that fact more than one aging conqueror who had joined the fleet. Hernan Cortés peered out from a weather-beaten face, wreathed by a beard that had grown gray. The man, derided as a cruel tyrant by many in Central America, had returned to the seas of the Old World to challenge the Barbary corsairs and perhaps to reclaim some of the honor and glory to which he felt so entitled. The fleet set out in 1541 to take back the Mediterranean under the command of the Genoese statesman Andrea Doria, but terrible storms beset the expedition and tossed about the invading ships. Cortés nearly drowned Doria, lost nearly 150 vessels. When at last the remaining soldiers made landfall, the locals massacred some and sold so many of the survivors into slavery. It was said the price of a Christian head became equal to that of an onion. In the wake of this failed attack, the Ottomans enjoyed unprecedented control over the Mediterranean under the cover of drooping tents. The markets of the Barbary coast, every day, bustled with the fruitful exchange of goods and people, stolen from passing ships or the coasts of West Africa and Europe. But even in the wake of victory, the Barbary states felt the absence of Dragut. He still sat behind rusty bars in Genoa. The Ottomans eventually surrounded the city and threatened to lay siege to it unless Dragut was set free. The wary Genoese refused. The Ottomans paid a fortune in ransom money. Although years in slavery had drained Dragut, freedom proved invigorating. He returned to the seas with ferocity. In 1546, the Ottoman Sultan named him the commander of the Ottoman fleet and Bey of Algiers. As the de facto leader of the Barbary corsairs, Dragut wrested control of Tripoli from the Knights of St. John and expelled European incursions on the Barbary coast. And so in 1560, Andrea Doria planned to destroy his rival again. His ships sailed out to swarm Dragut. But in the Battle of Gerba, Dragut decimated their fleet. Dragut and corsairs pulled the Spanish from their ships, removed their heads, and stacked their skulls into a pyramid. Dragut had overseen the apex of Ottoman control in the Mediterranean. He died in battle a few years later. The Barbary states he left behind were destined to change English and Dutch naval powers, pushed the Barbary corsairs into a tenuous peace. In the 17th century, the Barbary states were forced to move away from large-scale attacks on shipping in the Mediterranean and shifted their focus instead to slavery. And so now we return to the Atlantic. The quiet seaside village of Baltimore, set where the rocky coast meets verdant Irish hills. Squinting from the shore, villagers noticed strange sails. One day in 1631, armed Barbary pirates disembarked. Baltimore was left a ghost town. Little more than shattered windows and the scattered belongings of missing people. Every man, woman, and child who hadn't managed to flee was brought in chains to the Barbary coast. A priest watched their arrival in the slave market. It was a piteous sight to see them exposed for sale at Algiers, for when they parted the wife from the husband and the father from the child, then say I, they sell the husband here and the wife there, tearing from her arms the daughter, whom she could not hope to see ever again. Enslaved men were likely to spend their years as galley slaves, whilst women and children were liable to be forced into concubinage, and as Europeans would soon come to appreciate, slave trading paid handsomely. Crossing the Atlantic, the Spanish enslaved indigenous people to extract wealth from American soil. This new land and wealth soon attracted rival colonial powers. While the Spanish claimed Central and most of South America, and Portugal claimed Brazil, the English, Dutch, and French began to encroach and establish colonies in North America. If the old world's age of mass privateering had seen its heyday under Dragut, the new world's golden age of privateering had just begun. L'Ollonais would squeeze out the eyes, burn the flesh, and remove the tongues of those who refused to tell him what he wanted to hear. Now L'Ollonais demanded that the captured Spaniard tell him the truth, whether or not he knew a safe, unguarded path to the city of San Pedro. The Spaniard undoubtedly sensed that the Frenchman planned to raid the city and torture from its civilians every ounce of wealth that they possessed, and so the man told L'Ollonais that he knew no such way. To San Pedro, the story continues. Having asked them all, I found they could show him no other way. L'Ollonais grew outrageously passionate, so that he drew his cutlass and with it cut open the breast of one of these poor Spaniards, and pulling out his heart, began to bite and gnaw it with his teeth, like a ravenous wolf, saying to the rest, I will serve you all alike, if you show me not another way. Hereupon those miserable wretches promised to show him another way. It was cold cruelty that had lifted L'Ollonais from the misery of indentured servitude to the heights of pirate leadership. He had captured treasure ships and pillaged towns, all the while attracting followers to his cause. Like other so-called buccaneers, he operated out of the neglected island of Tortuga. Over the years, his fleet of one ramshackle ship had swelled to 8. But now the Spanish looked prepared. When he reached San Pedro, They repelled his attack. Fortune continued to turn against him. He sailed along the Central American coast, and his ship ran aground. To this effect, he determined to go on to the coast of Cartagena. But God Almighty, the time of his divine justice being now come, had appointed the Indians of Darien to be the instruments and executioners thereof. Hither Lalane came brought by his evil conscience, that cried for punishment, thinking to act his cruelties. But the Indians, within a few days after his arrival, took him prisoner and tore him in pieces alive, throwing his body limb by limb into the fire, and his ashes into the air, that no trace nor memory might remain of such an infamous, inhuman creature. Contemporaries of Lalane judged him a wicked man, but his rise had been made possible by the unique conditions brought about by rivalries among overstretched empires and nurtured in the backwater regions to which Spain tenuously laid claim. Lalane was part of a new and growing class of pirate, known in this age as buccaneers. Buccaneers had always existed, in defiance of the Spanish crown, but they hadn't always been pirates. They had gotten their start as poor settlers, who ventured into the overgrown north end of Spanish Hispaniola to rustle feral cattle and pigs. The forest dwellers sold this meat to English, Dutch and French merchants in exchange for weapons, ammunition, and rum, since Hispaniola's native Taino. People had traditionally cooked meat on wooden frames, called bacon. The French and English took to calling these meat smugglers buccaneers, or buccaneers. The Spanish, meanwhile, referred to these English, Dutch, and French merchants as interlopers. To safeguard their monopoly and ward them off, they drove the buccaneers from Hispaniola and decimated the animals they hunted. But in doing so, the Spanish inadvertently created a pirate haven, the island of Tortuga, a tropical paradise where from the 1630s onward, disaffected smugglers could carouse with French, English, and Dutch interlopers and build a Caribbean black market. Soon the men of Tortuga turned to piracy. The buccaneers began to sail out on small boats in the dead of night to ambush Spanish trade ships. Around this time, the French and Dutch rose as commercial and naval rivals to the Spanish in the 30 Years' War, which pitted the Catholic Habsburg rulers of Spain and Austria against the Dutch Republic and the rival Bourbon House of France. Spain's grasp on the New World was loosening. The English established colonies across the North American East Coast, and the French began to venture from Canada to Louisiana. But despite this dizzying succession of 17th century wars between European powers, the politics in Caribbean waters were refreshingly simple. The Spanish were the enemy. Regardless of goings-on in Europe, governors in the West Indies had made their choice. Colonial authorities weaponized the buccaneers of Tortuga with letters of marque and let them loose on the Spanish. The buccaneers smelt blood in the water. They raided cities along the Spanish Main, and Spain's merchant ships. Africans, escaped slaves, and outlaws also joined their ranks. In spite of the sadism practiced by buccaneers like Lalane, these self-titled brethren of the coast generally boasted a commonwealth spirit, whereby decisions were made collectively, resources were pooled together, and loot was divided according to well-understood parameters. Like the English sea dogs of Francis Drake's time, or the Barbary pirates, buccaneers towed the line between roguish outlaws and agents of the state. When war finally reached Tortuga, it was English colonial authorities who graciously provided a new buccaneer haven. England had taken Jamaica in 1655, and its city of Port Royal now provided implicit support for these anti-Spanish privateers under the regal banner of England. The buccaneers arrived in ships stocked with plundered rum slaves, cloth and cash crops. The ensuing trade facilitated the scandalous metamorphosis of Port Royal into the so-called Sodom of the New World. Here a buccaneer could squander his Spanish loot, cheer and brawl in a muggy tavern, or unwind on the warped mattress of a busy brothel. When one clergyman retired from his attempts to preach to the inhabitants of Port Royal, he remarked, "The majority of its population consists of pirates, cutthroats, whores, and some of the vilest persons in the whole of the world." Port Royal became a black market, boom town that rivaled the upright prosperity of England's Puritan Boston. Tortuga, meanwhile, continued to serve as a neutral port for buccaneers. And it was into this world of opportunity that Henry Morgan sailed in the early 1660s. The sailor in his early 30s had cut his teeth as a Welsh privateer, sacking Spanish cities steady. Deep-set brown eyes betrayed a cunning self-assuredness. He had trained under powerful buccaneers, but the time had come to build his own legacy. Anchoring in Port Royal, he flaunted his English letter of marque. It authorized attacks on Spanish shipping, and unsavory sailors wallowing in the town's taverns were keen to take advantage. 12 ships and 500 English and Frenchmen sailed out under Morgan's command. In a matter of days, Morgan had become the de facto king of the buccaneers. The invasion fleet dropped anchor on the Haitian coast. Morgan rallied the buccaneers and stormed the city of Puerto del Principe. They killed hundreds of Spanish defenders and pillaged for 3 days, but their earnings were insufficient. The buccaneers moaned and cursed until Morgan offered up an idea. They would move on to the Panamanian coast and attack the city of Portobello. Stuffed full of shimmering Spanish treasure, but crawling with well-trained militiamen, Portobello was a dangerous prize. The French, who had followed Morgan thus far, balked at the idea and sailed off. If our number is small, our hearts are great. And the fewer persons we are, the more union and better shares we shall have in the spoil. The unwavering Morgan roused the remaining crew and guided his fleet quietly. Through the Bocas del Toro, they transferred into smaller vessels. When they reached the coast, the weary pirates staggered onto the beach and marched towards Portobello. At daybreak they charged. The morning's silence was split by musket fire. Morgan and his men advanced in a haze of black powder. Women screamed and children fled. The buccaneers fired at every living thing in sight. Morgan overran the city, but the precious citadel of Fort Santiago still loomed in the distance. The Spanish militia atop its walls rained down stones and explosive pots on all who neared the fort. Morgan thus pulled back and adjusted his strategy. He readied siege ladders and corralled the city's nuns and friars. forcing them to march forth in a human shield. Thus the ladders were put into the hands of religious persons of both sexes, and these were forced, at the head of the companies, to raise and apply them to the walls. Thus many of the religious men and nuns were killed before they could fix the ladders, which at last being done, though with great loss of the said religious people, the pirates mounted them in great numbers. Being now on top of the walls, they kindled and cast in among the Spaniards. The buccaneers killed the governor in front of his own wife and daughter, and wounded or killed every other Spaniard therein. With Portobello hostage, Henry Morgan seized an opportunity. He sent a letter to the governor of Panama. "Tomorrow we plan to burn this city to the ground, and then set sail with all the guns and munitions from the castles. With us we will take all our prisoners, and we will show them the same kindness that the English prisoners have received in this place." Morgan added that he would spare the city of this fate if the governor promptly paid him 350,000 pieces of eight. From their conquered forts, Morgan's buccaneers repulsed the Panamanian counterattack, negotiated a ransom for 100,000 pieces of eight, and sailed off. However, news of changing diplomatic tides met them on the docks and spoiled their homecoming. It appeared the age of the buccaneer was coming to a close. England had adopted friendlier relations with Spain, and the Crown now rebuked this wave of piracy. Henry Morgan was forced to retire, but not for long. Global communication in those days was fraught with delay. Local Spanish authorities, ignorant of the new truce, sent out privateers to exact revenge on the English. For the Portobello raid, their hostility in turn provided Morgan with an opportunity to return to the seas and fulfill an earlier promise to sack the most prized metropolis in the Americas, Panama City. And so in early 1671, Morgan readied the buccaneers for his greatest plan yet. They overran the city, scavenged all the wealth they could find, brutalized the inhabitants, and burnt it to the ground. Morgan was arrested for piracy and transported to London in 1672 for punishment. But by the time he had arrived, the diplomatic winds had turned yet again. Spain had elected to support the Dutch in the Third Anglo-Dutch War and was therefore again an enemy of England. Morgan walked free, while throngs of commoners and royalty alike hailed him as a national hero who'd ravaged the hated Spanish. But in the coming decades, rarer and stricter letters of marque saw less cooperation between buccaneers of different nations and eventually fewer buccaneers altogether. The reign of the buccaneers ended not in glorious battle, but in stuffy courtrooms and royal negotiations. By the time of his death in 1688, the gentrified Henry Morgan had turned his piratical earnings into several profitable plantations, raked and picked by over 100 miserable slaves. It was said that Morgan gorged himself on food and drink in his final years. Privateers like himself had maintained the diplomatic veneer of national service. They attacked and stole within recognized parameters set by colonial authorities. The next generation of pirates would dispense with such niceties. Unshackled by diplomacy and unburdened by the weight of nation, the men of the Black Flag answered to no one. They knelt before no king. The Caribbean was at their mercy. A dozen sails rippled above panicked crews. Hundreds of cannons had been employed. To ensure the safety of this 12-ship floater, the Spanish were doing what they had done for more than a century, heaving gold home from the New World. But on this occasion, the figure that captured the horizon wasn't a black flag but a dark tempest. Dread overcame the sailors. It was too late to escape. Black clouds flooded the skies, and furious seas took hold of the ships. Desperate men clung to the masts, which tore asunder. Sails flew into the deluge. Sailors tumbled into the void. One galleon was thrown against the reef. Its hulking shadow sunk into the depths, with the drowned crew left to rot in the dark of its cabin. 11 of the 12 vessels suffered the same fate. In the morning, warm sunlight penetrated the clouds and shimmered on calm seas. The storm had claimed over 1,000 men. Scattered amongst their drifting corpses were precious metals and fine silks. 7 million pieces of 8 worth of South American treasure. This veritable fortune in gold and silver had been slated to sustain the Spanish Empire for the next year. It needed to be salvaged. The Spanish, at Havana, immediately set out an expedition to recover it, but word of the wreck had gotten out. Captain Henry Jennings sailed to the Gulf and found the Spaniards there. Upon the wreck, the money before spoken of was left on shore, deposited in a storehouse. The rovers came directly onto the place, bringing their little fleet to an anchor, and landing 300 men. They attacked the guard, who immediately ran away, and thus they seized the treasure, which they carried off, making the best of their way to Jamaica. Among the ne'er-do-wells of Port Royal, Charles Vane had appeared to cut a thoroughly unremarkable figure, but he had had ambition enough to join his more diplomatic friend, the former privateer Henry Jennings, who had managed to cobble together a crew. The gentlemanly Jennings had intended to stop the Spanish salvage expedition and steal as much treasure from the wreckage as he could, and together, that they did. On their way home from their successful expedition, Jennings and Vane encountered a Spanish ship. They raided it too, stole the treasure aboard, and went on their way. But selling their loot was complicated. The world had again turned against the pirate. Gone were the days of unrestrained buccaneering. Against the Spanish, this was peacetime. And London saw to it that its British colonies disavowed Jennings and the other pirates. During the War of Spanish Succession, England, the Dutch Republic, and Portugal had rallied against France over the rightful heir to the childless Spanish king, Charles II. Bloodshed and conquest had returned to the Caribbean, and the privateers roamed free. But now the winds had turned yet again, and the debaucherous doors of Port Royal were closed to stolen goods and maritime outlaws. If men like Henry Jennings and Charles Vane were going to become pirates, they needed friendly ports and a new base of operations. Only a few years removed from war, the Bahamian island of New Providence and its city of Nassau sat scarred and nearly abandoned. Green and red-throated parrots warbled above decaying forts, which hadn't flown British colors in years. Frothy waves lapped against white shores and leaning palm trees. Nassau also boasted a natural harbor that could hold 100 ships, located near trade routes, and the wreckage of the treasure fleet. This was the scene the former privateer Benjamin Hornigold stumbled upon. a new Eden bereft of any semblance of government. Hornigold quickly assumed control and gave the pirates exactly what they needed: Jennings' vein. And thousands of other disaffected sailors were welcomed into the pirates' paradise of Nassau. The pirates clambered ashore with pistols and swords and faces freckled with scurvy spots. Here, they spent their ill-gotten wealth on rolls of dice, rounds of rum, and seedy nights in rundown brothels. Chests of immaculate gold and silver from the wreckage made their way into town. In the throes of treasure fever, the pirates indulged in a lawless excess. From the fortified ports of Nassau, captains could launch attacks on passing merchant vessels. In the commonwealth of pirates, he who goes to the greatest length of wickedness is looked upon with a kind of envy amongst them, as a person of more extraordinary gallantry, and is thereby entitled to be distinguished by some post. And if such a one has but courage, he must certainly be a great man. The pirates attacked merchant ships hauling in tobacco, rum, cotton, tar, sugar, and slaves before returning to the safety of Nassau. Englishmen attacked Englishmen without regard for common heritage. Bold brutality became a badge of pride. But for all its anarchical trappings, Nassau came to be governed in a sense by two rival pirate factions, one under Henry Jennings and the other under Benjamin Hornigold. Hornigold's rising second in command, Edward Teach or Blackbeard, also held sway despite this. Top-down tyranny had no place in Nassau. In a period when monarchies were widespread and common sailors languished under draconian captains for poor wages, this so-called Republic of Pirates embraced fraternity and proto-egalitarianism in its undaunting pursuit of wealth. Half a century before the eloquent, democratic treatises of Paine and Jefferson, the pirate ship became a primordial site of defiance toward absolutism and monarchy. Indeed, the pirates of this era made decisions collectively, voted out incompetent and unfair captains, and shared their loot. Many followed pirate codes that harshly penalized disloyalty and the cheating of one's own crew, while many still reserved harsh violence for their victims. Pirates like Blackbeard spurned violence deemed unnecessary, cultivating instead an aura of fear to force victims into surrendering without resistance. The pirate flag, or Jolly Roger, was intended for just this purpose. The red or black flag often flew, emblazoned with icons of death skulls, bones, and hourglasses. Pirates used flags strategically tailing target vessels and hoisting the feared emblem of piracy when close enough to make good on their implicit threat to unleash carnage. But by 1726, King George I had had enough. From the opulence of his palace, he made a dramatic move to annihilate the pirate threat and conquer Nassau. His plan was to fracture whatever unity these pitiful enemies of the state professed. His Majesty had issued a royal pardon. In this carrot and stick approach, pirates who surrendered to the proper authorities in the coming year would be pardoned and free to carry on with their lives. But those who rejected this proposal would, in turn, receive a price on their head and a royal promise that they would be hunted down, arrested, and killed. When news from New York of the impending pardon reached the shores of Nassau, hundreds of pirates rejoiced. Henry Jennings and Benjamin Hornigold, and many other former privateers, had never intended to be reviled pirates. Profit had possessed them, but now they saw a fortuitous escape to the world of respectable commerce. Amidst their euphoria, the pro-pardon pirates restored the Union Jack atop the fort of Nassau. But there was a schism. Hundreds of men refused to return to the mundane poverty of civility, those who embraced the life of a ship-borne outlaw and the bloody quest for fortune and leisure. These pirates, including Edward England, Christopher Billy, One-Hand Condent, and Calico Jack Rackham, now found a leader in the most die-hard anti-pardon pirate of them all, Charles Vane. Vane rallied his supporters and staged an armed takeover of the fort. He tore down the Union Jack and raised high the grinning face of death, the black flag. For the time being, Nassau would remain the unapologetic property of pirates, a brazen island of liberty, chaos, and wealth. In their defiance of King George, Charles Vane and his supporters even attempt to draw support from the Jacobite cause, which sought to restore the deposed House of Stuart upon the British throne. Although the bid was unsuccessful, tensions in Nassau were rising. A pirate council was called in 1718. Vane argued that they should fortify the island and stand against the British. His old friend Henry Jennings disagreed. He advocated taking the pardon. A great clamor and shouting came over the room, and nothing was decided upon. The Republic of Pirates felt irrevocably fractured, and the end appeared close. And indeed, the exodus had begun. Henry Jennings and 15 of his men sailed to British Bermuda and formally received pardons. Others fitted their ships for long, piratical journeys elsewhere, to South America or Africa. Blackbird, meanwhile, had not been seen for months. In February, the HMS Phoenix arrived in Nassau. Captain Vincent Pierce formally offered the pirates the king's pardon. Benjamin Hornigold and the pro-pardon pirates happily accepted. They warned Pierce of the zealous Charles Vane, who was at that very moment outfitting a ship for piracy. Captain Pierce sailed around the island and let loose a volley of cannon fire on Vane's vessel, arresting Charles Vane. In a show of good faith to the pirates, he released him again, and so Vane and his crew accepted the king's pardon, with the promise that they would turn away from piracy. Pierce also informed them that the former buccaneer, Woodes Rogers, had been appointed governor of Nassau and would arrive in the summer to take the island and restore order. Vane had accepted the pardon in the moment, but he hadn't the slightest intention of keeping his word. Rebellion grew, and so, sailing past Pierce, Charles Vane hoisted the black flag in defiant theatricality and left Nassau to exact cruelties on nearby trade routes. For 3 weeks, Vane continued on like this, hacking and hanging his victims. He captured a dozen merchant ships and crippled trade in the Bahamas. When he finally sailed back to Nassau, Vane was delighted to find that Pierce had departed. But something else ominous soon appeared. A hulking 5-vessel fleet with towering warships approached and laid anchor. Blackbird was in town. His 700-strong crew found their land legs in the taverns and brothels of Nassau, and for a brief moment it looked like the glorious pre-pardon days of the island had returned. Blackbird, however, was not keen on a potential run-in with Woodes Rogers, and in a few days he and his crew sailed away. Finally, Vane attacked Benjamin Hornigold and proclaimed himself the governor of New Providence. It seemed Charles Vane was the last true pirate lord in this corner of the world. Old allies had turned against him. Henry Jennings had even accepted a privateering commission to rest. Vane but Vane, rich with the spoils of his exploits, now planned to set sail for Brazil with his crew, where they might regroup and build another pirate paradise. But as they readied their ships, hostile sails appeared. Woodes Rogers blocked Vane in the harbor. This was the final chance to take the pardon and escape alive. All surrendered to the pardon, except Charles Vane and his crew, which happened after this manner. The harbor had two inlets, by means of a small island lying at the mouth of it, at one of which both the men of war entered, and left the other open so that Vane slipped his cable, set fire to a large prize they had there, and resolutely put out, firing at the man of war as he went off. Despite this attack, Woodes Rogers nevertheless became the governor of New Providence, and he entrusted Benjamin Hornigold with a dangerous mission to hunt down Charles Vane. But Vane had informants and old allies scattered across the West Indies, and he shrewdly evaded Rogers and Hornigold at every turn. As Charles Vane persisted in a bloody tour of piracy, dozens of superficially reformed pirates betrayed the pardon, stole ships, and sailed off to join his course. If arrested, they would be tried under maritime law, and thus afforded no jury. Pirate trials were little more than a show, well-promoted propaganda, intended to sear a gruesome image in the minds of all. Would-be pirates without the aid of a defense lawyer. The mostly illiterate sea thieves would be asked to prove their innocence to a panel of appointed officials. The accused would inevitably be found guilty, hanged on the foreshore and buried in an unmarked grave, or left to rot in a swinging cage. This was the fate, the crown now reserved for all pirates. But Charles Vane pressed onwards. While many of his old crew, like Edward England and Christopher Condent, had left for Africa and Brazil, one powerful pirate still stalked American waters. Vane found Blackbird in the outer Cook Inlet, off the coast of North Carolina, and ordered cannons fired in a salute to his fellow pirate. As the two crews fraternized and drank for several nights on the beach, Vane likely attempted to convince Blackbird to sail with him, but Blackbird again sailed off separately, intent on staging a few last attacks on vulnerable targets before his own planned retirement from piracy. Only a month later, in November of 1718, British Lieutenant Robert Maynard caught up to Blackbird and launched a surprise attack. Blackbird quickly fired back. His crew wounded or killed 21 of the British attackers and boarded the enemy vessel to finish the job, but a dozen British sailors lay hidden in the hold. They emerged and charged with Maynard across a deck. Sleek with blood in a haze of musket fire, the giant Blackbird appeared and lunged at the rival. Captain Maynard locked swords with Blackbird. Swinging furiously, the pair dueled until at last Maynard struck his challenger. The enormous pirate shattered the sword, lodged inside of him, and reached for his pistol. But again Maynard was quicker and shot him. Here was an end of that courageous brute, who might have passed in the world for a hero had he been employed in good cause. The lieutenant caused Blackbeard's head to be severed from his body and hung up at the bowsprit, and then he sailed to Bathtown to get relief for his wounded men. It might have seemed prudent for Charles Vane to avoid a similar fate, and he retreated when a French naval ship fired on him just a day later. But his crew took his caution for cowardice. In accordance with the pirate code, the crew exercised their right to vote him out. His shipmate Calico Jack Rackham took the helm, and with a small gang of loyal supporters, Charles Vane was sent off in a meager sloop. He continued to attack and rob merchant vessels, but soon a dark storm descended upon his ship. The small vessels screeched and teetered over thunderous swells. Vane and the crew were thrashed about the deck until the waves overtook them. Their plunder was lost, and the crew was thrown overboard. And yet this wasn't the end. Among the drifting wreckage that washed up on the still shores of a desert island were splintered wood, strips of sail, and the captain himself, Charles Vane. The castaway had cheated death. He crawled ashore through clumped sand and cursed his wretched lot. Here on some unknown stretch of land, Vane languished days passed under a beating sun. He spent his hours gazing out at a desolate blue, green horizon, seeing not another soul. At last a group of turtle hunters stopped by to find a stinking and hungry Charles Vane. Dressed in weather-worn clothes, they provided the miserable pirate with turtle flesh to sustain himself and continued on their way. Vane remained brooding on the island for weeks, until in early 1719. He spotted his saving opportunity. An English vessel from Jamaica stopped on the island. Vane happened to be an old acquaintance of its commander, Captain Holford, but Holford was a retired buccaneer who knew Vane well, enough to bar the conniving pirate from boarding. Still, some part of Holford took pity on the castaway. Rather than arrest Vane outright, Holford gave his old friend a running start. "I'm now going down the bay, and shall return hither in about a month. And if I find you upon the island when I come back, I'll carry you to Jamaica and hang you." Holford sailed off, and Vane was left to scour the horizon for a rescuer. Within a few days, another English ship arrived. The sailors met the weary castaway and heard his sympathetic plight. Vane gave them a false name and joined their crew. They began to sail out of the bay. One would be apt to think that Vane was now pretty safe and likely to escape the fate which his crimes had merited, but here a cross accident happened that ruined all. Holford, returning from the bay, was met by this ship. The captains being very well acquainted together, Holford was invited to dine, and as he passed along to the cabin, he chanced to cast his eye down the hold, and there saw Charles Vane at work. Holford arrested Vane at gunpoint and carried the chained pirate back to Jamaica. Their authorities finally locked him in a cell. The anti-piracy efforts of the Crown had worked well. In short order, the last of the great pirates would disappear, including those who had fled eastward. Pardoned men like Henry Jennings could retire in domesticity. The thousands who refused the king's offer were hunted down and hanged. Others lost their lives on the high seas. Some would be dashed against rocks in hurricanes. The great Bartholomew Roberts was shot in the throat, and still others, like the brutal Edward Lowe, who notoriously forced a man to eat his own broiled lips, disappeared. Though likely captured and killed, a wishful Caribbean criminal might imagine missing pirates like Lowe and Henry, every had made it out alive, that they had cheated the hangman and lived out the rest of their days, sipping rum amidst their plunder. As for Charles Vane, A year in prison culminated in a stuffy trial, flanked by crimson-clad colonial guardsmen, and on March 29th in the year 1721, Vane was walked to Gallows Point in the once lawless Port Royal and hanged by the neck until he died. His executioners placed his lifeless body in a cage, which teetered for years at the harbor's entrance of Gun Quay, such that the rotting flesh of Charles Vane nourished the passing crow, and his slumping visage prophesied the fate of all who sailed under the black flag. Let me ask you, my dear Marquis, in such an enlightened and such a liberal age, how is it possible the great maritime powers of Europe should submit to pay an annual tribute to the little piratical states of Barbary? Would to heaven we had a navy able to reform those enemies to mankind, or crush them into non-existence. The Barbary states, which had so terrified Europe under the likes of Dragut, had over the centuries modified the primary means by which they extracted wealth from the seas. They now guaranteed safe passage for the feeble merchant ships that crossed the Mediterranean, so long as their mother countries submitted to pay an exorbitant tribute to the Barbary corsair leaders. If not, the Barbary corsairs would do what they had always done: capture the boats and kill, ransom or enslave everyone aboard. The corsairs even forced the fledgling United States of America to pay the tribute for passage into the Mediterranean. By 1797, the Americans had paid in total a fifth of their annual budget to the Barbary states. Despite the protests of taxpayers, the United States had little choice but to pay. They lacked the naval might to counter the growing Barbary demands. Their eventual refusal to pay prompted the corsairs to capture American vessels and sell the men aboard in their slave markets. The monetary loss, buttressed by the image of enslaved white Americans, proved galvanizing. President Thomas Jefferson raised an expensive fleet that sailed out to bombard the Barbary states. In the coming years, warships would burn and whole crews would perish in the fighting. Sweden and Sicily also took up arms against their barbarian enemies, until at last the barbarian states relented. 1815 saw a three-day Second Barbary War and a renewed European commitment to suppress the corsairs. After the Napoleonic Wars, this was the downfall of these once powerful pirates who had roamed the seas since the Middle Ages. By that time, the War of 1812 had ended, and many privateers, employed by the British and Americans, found themselves without work. A simultaneous wave of revolution severed Spain's hold on her New World colonies. The coasts of Latin America and the Caribbean thus became once again fertile ground for pirates. But the combined efforts of industrializing world powers undermined their strength. President James Monroe spearheaded the efforts to eradicate piracy. Meanwhile, state-sanctioned forms of armed robbery also disappeared from the high seas as nations moved away from the practice of privateering. These trends were codified in anti-privateering proclamations and multinational movements, such that the seas once harassed by the sea peoples, the Virtual Brothers and the Buccaneers, now waxed and waned a little more quietly. And trade ships followed their routes, with a little more monotony. A man called Charles Gibbs graced these closing pages of pirate history. Without an ounce of shame, when arrested and convicted in 1831, the American pirate admitted the murder of 400 people and readily told of buried treasure. The quantity of money buried in different parts of the West Indies islands is beyond calculation. Immense treasures have been secreted there, a great portion of which will never be found. Gibbs was brought to the very same speck of land that would usher in a new global, urbanized age under the gaze of Lady Liberty. Ellis Island would soon receive millions of hopeful immigrants into the United States, and it was there that Charles Gibbs was hanged. Piracy had always been complicated. Theft, torture, murder, and enslavement were perpetrated on the high seas by people, states, and individuals possessing varying degrees of legal support. Men like Francis Drake or Henry Morgan might have recoiled at the assertion that they were anything but law-abiding patriots. They fancied themselves heroes to be lauded, and not outlaws to be feared. Charles Gibbs, however, was different from the alleged buried treasure. To the absurd number of deaths for which he took credit, it is thought that much of his post-conviction confession was fabricated, that perhaps the ill-fated Gibbs desired, in his final days, to hoist his legend alongside the pantheon of pirates who once roamed these waters. Outlaws like Blackbeard Henry Avery and Charles Vane. Men for whom piracy was not merely maritime banditry, born out of desperation but a proud culture. A defiant flag raised brutally against imperial excess. An unjust enterprise, unburdened by the pretense of altruism, where shameless greed and sadism might lie alongside nascent republicanism. In garish harmony. It was at the tail end of the Golden Age in July of 1723, when a periodical known as the Monthly Mercury recounted a bit of news from the West Indies. This day 26 of the pirates taken by His Majesty's ship, the Greyhound Captain Solgard, were executed here their black flag, under which they had committed abundance of piracies, and murders was affixed to one corner of the gallows. It had in it the portraiture of death, with an hourglass in one hand and a dart in the other, striking into a heart, and 3 drops of blood delineated as falling from it. This flag they called Old Roger, and used to say they would live and die under it.